Hello, I'm Mike and welcome to my channel, and today I'd like to give a short commentary on Matthew chapter 2. In Matthew chapter 2 jumps right in, he says in the first verse, Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the reign of King Herod. Now, that might seem like a very simple statement that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but really it has huge implications because the prophecy is that the Messiah would come out of Bethlehem. So in order to be the Messiah, the person has to fulfill that part of coming out of Bethlehem. And Matthew tells us straight up that he has fulfilled that part of the prophecy. And throughout his time, with the Jewish people, many people did not even know that he was born in Bethlehem. They assumed that he was born in Nazareth. So they tried to claim that since he was from Nazareth that he couldn't be the Messiah. And they didn't even put in the effort to really even try and find out where he was born. The fact was that he was born in Bethlehem, and as an infant, he went back home to Nazareth. Now, this first statement also says that he was born during the reign of King Herod the Great. And we know that King Herod was the king there from 37 BC to 4 BC when he died. That was his reign. And a lot of people believe that Jesus was born between 6 BC and 4 BC because of when Herod died and because of when the wise men saw the star when it first arose. But I believe that the Bible shows that he was clearly born in 4 BC, and I'll go over the verses and the evidence that say that it was 4 BC. The first evidence we have that Jesus was born in 4 BC is that Joseph and Mary had to take Jesus to Jerusalem. Since Jesus was her firstborn son, he had to be presented to the Lord. And also with childbirth, the mother becomes unclean, and she has to go to the temple to give some sacrifices in order to be cleansed. So with having a boy, that would make it at 40 days. So at 40 days, she had to go to Jerusalem, offer a sacrifice, and present her firstborn son to God. And in Luke chapter 2, it tells us that they came to Jerusalem, that they brought Jesus there, that they did the sacrifices. And it says when they had finished their sacrifices, then they went back home to Nazareth. So Joseph and Mary brought Jesus at the 40-day mark to Jerusalem to be cleansed, to offer sacrifices, and to present Jesus to God. And then they went home, just like Luke chapter 2 says clearly. The second part of the evidence that says that Jesus was born in 4 BC is that when the wise men got to Bethlehem, Jesus is referred to twice with the Greek word for infant. So when the wise men arrived there, Jesus was still an infant. The third piece of evidence was when Jesus first started his ministry when he was 30 years old. And he was talking to some people about the temple in Jerusalem. And he says, "Tear down this temple and I will rebuild it in 3 days." Well, the people misunderstood, and they thought he was talking about the literal temple in Jerusalem. He says, "What? We've been working on this temple for 46 years, and you're going to rebuild it in 3 days?" Well, Herod the Great started this rebuilding project on the temple in 20 BC. So if you add 46 years to it, that would make it 26 AD. And since Jesus was about 30 years old when he started his ministry in 26 AD, that would make his birth 4 BC. So we have 3 different parts of evidence here. Is that the Greek word for infant is used in Bethlehem when the wise men get there. Joseph and Mary took him at 40 days to Jerusalem, performed the ceremonies and went back home to Nazareth when he was still just an infant. And we have that he was 30 years old in 26 AD when he started his ministry. The next verse in Matthew chapter 2 says, "About that time, some wise men from eastern lands arrived in Jerusalem, asking." So here it says, about the time that Jesus was born, these wise men showed up in Jerusalem asking, "Where is the newborn king?" So Matthew tells us that they arrived about the time Jesus was born, but the wise men tell Herod that his star rose 2 years ago. It doesn't say that Jesus was 2 years old. It doesn't say that he was born when they first saw the star. No, it says, "Where is the newborn king?" Where is he? Where's the newborn king of the Jews? And notice that it just says some wise men. It doesn't tell us how many wise men that there were. A lot of people think that there was 3 wise men just simply because there was 3 gifts given, but the Bible does not tell us how many. It doesn't tell us their names. All of that stuff was just an invention that was made up many years later. For all we know, and some commentators think that it was a huge caravan that came, with many soldiers and many servants. And they went around asking in Jerusalem, "Where is the newborn king?" So this huge caravan that came with soldiers and servants was easily noticeable. And the king noticed that, and he was upset about it, disturbed about it. And in verse 2, Matthew says, "Where is the newborn king of the Jews?" Now, actually, in the Greek Bible, and we know that the New Testament was all written in Greek and then translated to English. In the Greek Bible, it doesn't actually say newborn. All it says is the Greek word for like coming forth or to be born. It doesn't actually give the age of the child and stuff. But the translators here on the New Living Translation believe that the wise men were referring to the newborn king. And when the wise men get to Bethlehem, the Greek word for infant is used there twice. So it seems like the translators just went ahead and put newborn in on verse 2 when the Greek Bible doesn't actually say that. And the next part of the verse in Matthew chapter 2 says, "We saw his star as it arose, and we have come to worship him." Now, there is no information in the Bible or anywhere else, how these wise men would have known that this star had anything to do with Jesus. There's nothing in the scriptures to say that look for this particular type of star, in the heavens at this time. There's nothing like that. The only thing that the Bible says at all is when Balaam is talking about that he sees a star in the distant future that will arise out of Jacob. But he gives us no information, for recognizing that particular star. Now, it seems like the only way that the wise men would have had any of this knowledge is by direct revelation from God, probably in a dream, because later on they have a dream by God telling them not to go back and see Herod. So I would assume that God told the wise men about this star and the significance of it. And of course, it is not a star. It definitely does not behave like any star. And I would think that this is probably just an angel surrounded by the glory of God, bright enough to appear like a star. And we'll talk about some verses that, show that this is not a star. And in verse 3, it says, "King Herod was deeply disturbed when he heard this, as was everyone in Jerusalem." Now, King Herod would be deeply disturbed because he was not Jewish and he was not the rightful king of the Jews. The only reason that he was king is because that the Romans backed him. So by force, he was the king. And he was an evil, crazy man, and he would do anything to keep his power. So of course he's going to be upset if there's a rightful heir that comes along to be king of the Jews. And the people should be disturbed and upset as well because Herod is an evil man that kills people. And when he gets upset, they need to be upset. And in verse 4, it says, he called a meeting of the leading priests and teachers of religious law and asked, where is the Messiah supposed to be born? And it seems kind of strange that King Herod would automatically assume that this newborn king is actually the Messiah. And he calls them and asks, where is the Messiah born? So that is a surprising thing on his part. And in verse 5, it says, in Bethlehem in Judea, they say, for this is what the prophet wrote. And you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the ruling cities of Judah, for a ruler will come from you who will be the shepherd of my people Israel. So the teachers and the priests here knew the prophecy, but they didn't seem interested enough to even go see Jesus. Of course, when Jesus visits them later, they reject him as the Messiah. You would think that they would be interested in him being the Messiah because they believed that the Messiah was going to free them from the oppression of the Roman Empire and judge all the surrounding nations. But they chose to reject Jesus, so that they could maintain their own authority. And verse 7 says, then Herod called for a private meeting with the wise men, and he learned from them the time when the star first appeared. Now, when the star first appeared does not mean that that's when Jesus was actually born, because when the wise men get to Bethlehem, it says that he was an infant then. So the 2-year time frame was just giving them travel time so that they could get to Bethlehem at about the time that Jesus was born. Then in verse 8, it says, then he told them, go to Bethlehem and search carefully for the child. And when you find him, come back and tell me so that I can go and worship him too. So Herod directs them to Bethlehem, and it seems like he assumes that, the prophecy of the Messiah coming from Bethlehem is true, and that the king of the Jews that the wise men is looking for is the actual Messiah. So he directs them to the place of Bethlehem. And of course, he's just lying about the worship, because there's no way that he's going to let a challenger to his throne survive. Then in verse 9, after this interview, the wise men went their way, and the star they had seen in the east guided them to Bethlehem. It went ahead of them and stopped over the place where the child was. So it seems like the star must have disappeared for a while because they had to stop in Jerusalem and ask for directions. And now with them heading out, now the star has appeared, and it says that it went on ahead of them and stopped over where Jesus was. So obviously, stars do not do this. They do not lead and then stop. And from the sounds of it, the star may have actually stopped over the very exact house that Jesus was living in at the time. And in this verse, when it says child, it actually uses the Greek word paidion, which is the word for infant. So this is one of the 2 places in Bethlehem, when they're at Bethlehem, that uses the Greek word for infant. And in verse 10, it says, when they saw the star, they were filled with joy. They entered the house and saw the child with his mother, Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Now, these Gentiles were filled with joy, to meet and worship the newborn king of the Jews. And it seems like the Jews were not interested. And here it says that they went into the house, and a lot of people like to claim that a significant amount of time went by because they are no longer living in a stable, but now they're in a house. But yet the Greek word used for Jesus is infant, and he never lived in a stable anyway. Back in those days, at night, the people brought their animals into the house to keep them safe, and they had mangers in the house for the animals, and that is where Mary laid Jesus. They never lived in a stable. The Bible does not ever say that they lived in a stable. It just says that there was no room at the inn, and that Mary laid him in a manger. And check out my video that I made, Was Jesus Born in a Stable? And I go over that in much more depth. But my belief is that he was born in a house. That's where he lived. That's where he was when the Magi got there. And he was just an infant because the Greek word here is infant. Now, back in those days, it was common for people to bow down and give gifts to the king. But these people also worshiped him. So it makes me believe that maybe these wise men actually knew who Jesus was because they bowed down and they worshiped. It says in the next part of the verse, then they opened their treasure chest and gave him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And it seems like most commentaries think that the gold points to being a king, and that frankincense represents deity, and that myrrh is for his coming death. Just because there were 3 gifts does not mean that there were 3 wise men, and the Bible does not say that. There may have been 100 wise men, and the 3 gifts were just, for all of them. And they thought that those 3 gifts were the ones that were appropriate. In verse 12, it says, when it was time to leave, they returned to their own country by another route, for God had warned them in a dream not to return to Herod. So we see here that the wise men were obedient to the word of God, and that God has communicated them in a dream. And it makes me believe that this is not the first time, that the whole thing started off by God informing them about this star and what it was all about. In verse 13, it says, after the wise men were gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. Get up, flee to Egypt with the child and his mother. The angel said, stay there until I tell you to return, because Herod is going to search for the child to kill him. Now, this must have happened very shortly after the wise men left, maybe even that same night, because Jesus has to make it to Jerusalem when he's 40 days old so that he can be presented to the Lord and so that Mary can do the cleansing ceremony. And it would only take 2 or 3 days to get to the border of Egypt. So this was probably done very quickly after the wise men left, and it didn't take many days to get that part of their journey done. Verse 14 says, that night Joseph left for Egypt with the child and his mother, Mary, and they stayed there until Herod's death. Well, we know that Herod died in 4 BC, and we know that Jesus made it to the temple when he was 40 days old. So when he went to the border of Egypt, it probably didn't take long before Herod had died, and it might have only been a day or 2. And then the angel told them to come back to Israel. And that verse goes on to say, this fulfilled what the Lord had spoken through the prophet. I called my son out of Egypt. Now, this is a quote from Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, and it was really initially about the exodus of the Jews from Egypt. But here Matthew says that this is the fulfillment, calling his son out of Egypt, calling Jesus out of Egypt. And often we see that in the Bible. We see partial fulfillments in the Old Testament, and then we see the actual fulfillment in the New Testament. In verse 16, it says, Herod was furious when he realized that the wise men had outwitted him. He sent soldiers to kill all the boys in and around Bethlehem who were 2 years old and under, based on the wise men's report of the star's first appearance. Now, of course, Jesus was an infant, and he wasn't 2 years old, and Herod based the information on when the star rose, not actually the birth. So maybe he either didn't understand about when Jesus was born, or he was just thorough and wanted to kill everyone just in case. In verse 17, it says, Herod's brutal action fulfilled what God had spoken through the prophet Jeremiah. A cry was heard in Ramah, weeping in great mourning. Rachel weeps for her children, refusing to be comforted, for they are dead. And this is a quote out of Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 15, and it originally had to do with the exile of the Jews once the Babylonians had defeated them in Jerusalem. But of course, here, Rachel is probably representing all Israeli mothers, weeping for the birth of their children, the ones that Herod had just killed. And in verse 19, when Herod died, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt. "Get up," the angel said, "take the child and his mother back to the land of Israel, because those who were trying to kill the child are dead." And once again, this was probably very quick. They probably stayed in Egypt no more than a day or two, before Herod died, and then they went on their way. And verse 21 says, "So Joseph got up and returned to the land of Israel with Jesus and his mother. But when he learned that the new ruler of Judea was Herod's son Archelaus, he was afraid to go there. Then after being warned in a dream, he left for the region of Galilee. So the family went and lived in the town Nazareth. This fulfilled what the prophet said, he will be called a Nazarene." Now, Archelaus was an evil man, just like Herod was. And Archelaus was known for killing innocent people, just to punish the Jews and cause fear. So Joseph definitely didn't want to go where he was in control. So he ended up going back to Nazareth. But that's where his hometown was anyway. Him and Mary both lived there prior to the census, prior to them going to Bethlehem. So from Egypt, he went to Nazareth. And then from Nazareth, he had to go to Jerusalem for the cleansing ceremony and to present Jesus to God as Mary's firstborn son. And then Luke chapter 2 tells us when they were done, then they went back to Nazareth. Now, nowhere in the Old Testament is Jesus ever called a Nazarene. But that doesn't mean that Matthew is lying or that he just invented this story. All it means is that the prophets who said this were never recorded in the Old Testament. And John tells us, that many things that were said and done were never recorded in the Bible, just simply because it would be too much. He exaggerated and says, if everything was written down, then the books would cover the whole earth. So Matthew isn't lying or making this up. It's just that those things were not recorded. Thank you so much for watching. And if you have any comments, please leave them.